In this video, we're going to talk about graphic design in Krita. I'm going to show you how I create the YouTube thumbnails you will find on GDQuest from now on entirely with Krita. So just before you ask, as far as free software is concerned, I've tried working with Inkscape, which I have here, and with GIMP, GNU Image Editor. I've also tried, surprisingly enough, Blender for that. It's a possible option, especially with version 2.8 and the new 2D drawing tools. But I've found that Krita is the most efficient options for my needs because things like color selection, you have layer styles that are non-destructive. There's a bit of polishing still needed in the program to be super efficient with it, but it's all editable, non-destructive. You will see that in the video. For the background, I downloaded a texture from CC0 Textures, link in the description below. So this is a collection of PBR textures that you can use in your 3D projects and all in the public domain. Very high quality, created with Substance Designer for the most part, if not all of them. And I went to the wood category to have a polished wood finish in the background, and I downloaded this one. So you can click on one of the buttons. 2K is all you need for 1080p picture, and download it. So with that, we're going to create our thumbnail. For this tutorial, though, I'm going to use a different texture. So allow me to go to the concrete category and to pick something a little different than the wood to give you a different example. I'm going to download this one, then head back to Krita, open my file browser, and in my downloads folder, I have my concrete texture. So I'm going to extract it here, and you want to drag and drop the color texture into Krita. But first we have to create a document. So in Krita, go to new file. We're going to use 920 by 1080, which is the standard resolution for YouTube thumbnails. So create. Then I'm going to drag and drop my concrete texture, and I'm going to insert it as a new file layer. When you use file layers like these, Krita will reference the original file and will preserve all the pixel information that's inside of it. All right? So note that it links to the file. So if you move the file on your file system, it's going to break a little bit. So one thing that you can do is go to your texture here. So I'm going to copy my concrete textures, and then I'm going to open my pictures folder where I have a library of all the textures that I use. So I have a texture folder, PBR, and everything PBR from CC0 Textures is stored here. So I'm going to paste the textures and then redo the operation in Krita. I'm going to delete that layer and drag and drop my concrete color there and insert as a new file layer. All right, now I'm going to unlock the background by clicking on the lock icon next to the layer's name. Press Shift Delete to delete the layer. Same thing for that transparent layer 1, so that we're left only with our concrete background, which I'm going to lock by clicking the lock icon next to it. Now, we're going to add a new layer to add some shadow. So note that my shortcuts are not exactly the ones by default in Krita. You would do Insert or click the Add Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel. Press G to get the gradient tool, and I'm going to pick a color, a dark one, that I'm going to use to add shadow to my concrete texture. I'm going to pick a dark blue. You can right-click to get the pop-up palette and select it like that. I have the quick color selector bound to Shift-A so that I can grab a color anytime. So again, for these custom shortcuts, you want to go to Settings, Configure Krita, and to Keyboard Shortcuts, and then you would look for Color or Color Selector. I think that was Show the Color Selector. You can see that it's Shift-I by default, but I bound it to Shift-A so that it's under my left hand. And from there, we're going to zoom back on the image and click and drag to add some shadow around my concrete here. So I'm adding shadow, especially at the bottom, to give it a sense of lighting. I'm going to set the layer type to multiply so that it preserves the details of the underlying layer and lower the opacity to soften the effect. Then you can press Ctrl U to bring the HSL filter, and then you can play with the hue of your shadow. So you can see that I used a fairly desaturated color, making the tint subtle, but this is going to set the tone of the image. So I like to have something in the blues or purples so that I can really make the foreground pop with vibrant yellows, pinks, etc. colors that really grab attention. Then you can play with the saturation slider to add intensity to the shadow's tone. You can see the effect is once again a little subtle, but it can help. Then finally play with the lightness to, again, if you increase both the lightness and saturation, you're going to get some more colorful shadows. So this will be our background. Now we're going to add the box that's going to sit in front of that. And for that, we're going to add a vector layer. You have to click the small arrow next to the add button, click vector layer. And from there, all the drawing tools in the toolbox up there are going to draw vector shapes. To make sure that we snap to the edges of the document, we're going to press Shift S to open the snapping options menu, and we're going to make sure that image bounds is selected. Now, again, zoom out a little bit on the document, and I'm going to click around the edges of my document and click and drag, and you should see my box snaps to the document's corners. Now, as I created that vector shape, I only get an outline, and this is due to my tool options at the moment. And I don't have the tool options in my interface right here, so I'm going to right click anywhere in the toolbar, for example, to open the Dockers selector. And you want to look for tool options, which is around the top. So I'm going to uncheck and recheck it because I use floating tool options like these to make it easier to access the tool options with my mouse cursor, with my tablet. So now I'm going to use the vector select shape here. It's going to automatically select my shape, but you can use that to click on any vector shape on the canvas to select it and to see the corresponding options in the tool options docker. I'm going to go to the fill category and select a uniform color fill, and you should see it update. Then go to the line category and remove the outline from that. You can also see that I haven't snapped to the right side of the document, so I'm going to click and drag the right handle to get that. To rezoom to fit the document in the view. And we're going to stop there for the color. We can move the tool options. I'm going to move them back under the layers docker. This is probably how your interface looks. Now, anytime you can pick a color in the color picker, and it's going to assign it to your selected vector shape, all right? You don't need to use the tool options, which are slower to use. So the way I like to work is press Shift A, and then I can tweak my color. Sometimes it takes a moment to update, but that way I can really fine-tune the color I'm going to pick. And I'm going to have some kind of blue, not too saturated background, or we could go in the purples. Let's see what works. Okay. So anytime you can go back to this layer and tweak the background's color. We're going to add that layer to a group, so press Ctrl G for that, or we can directly press normally Ctrl Shift G for you. For me, it'll be Ctrl Alt G to add a clipping group. This is going to create a new layer that is set to use the transparency of the layers below it in the group. And from there, we can press G again. So this is a pixel layer. So we can use the gradient tool on that. And we're going to add a bit of a gradient to our purple tone. So I'm going to select a dark desaturated purple and add some gradient on the right. So you can use that gradient layer in normal mode, like I'm doing now, and then use Ctrl U again to tweak the saturation, the hue, if you want to do a bit of hue shifting. So you can shift towards the blues if you want to, by going to the left here if you have a purple, or you can go to the right to give it a more red tone. I don't want this to be too saturated. You can also play with the lightness and darkness this way. So you can easily tweak your gradient. You can also use the layer blending modes, obviously, to change the effect if you want to use overlay, for example, with a light and a dark tone to increase the contrast of this layer. Okay, but this is our background. We're going to add text to it. So let's select the top group, the layer. I'm going to create a new text. So for that, select the text tool. You're going to click and drag to set the height of the text roughly. Now it's using our default color here. So let's make sure that we change that. I should have changed it before selecting the text tool. You can control double click on the text to edit it. Select all the text with Control A in the window, and we're going to pick white here and save to see the change in our view. Now I want to select a different font. I use Montserrat, and you want to set the weight to whatever you feel comfortable with, but I tend to work with extra bold here, and just 1 or 2 words. So let's say we're going to call this one Krita here. You can click on the save button every time to save in the current version of Krita, but you can also press Alt-S and it's going to save and update. I'm going to try and increase the size of the font to something like 48. Save. Okay. And it will have to do full now. Now to move the text, you're going to have to use the vector select tool arrow. You can't move the text directly with the text tool at the moment. And with snapping on, by default, you should snap to the document center, so it's very easy to center your text this way. So the font weight bug being there, we are not able to change it. Here's one trick to go around it, because we have access not only to the text itself, but to the SVG source. And if you know a bit of HTML and CSS, you can change the styles here. So go to the SVG source category and make sure that you click on SVG. Then we are going to add, after some semicolon here, we're going to add font-weight, colon, and then you can set the weight. So you can use multiple of 100 most of the time. Something like 800 should give us the black result here. It's a pretty heavy font weight. And then again, so once we close the text, we automatically switch to the vector selection tool so that we can move our text. And I'm going to move it and snap it to the center. You can see how the bounding box of the text is larger than the text itself, unfortunately. So it makes it sometimes a little harder to align the text, for example, vertically to center it precisely in the box. But this will do for now. Now we can't directly apply a gradient to the text at the moment. We can change the color, and you can change that again, just like other vector shapes. So you can tweak the color by using any color selector in Krita or the color palette. You can set also vector shape main color, the fill color, by left clicking. And if you right click, this will set the layers border color instead. And I'm going to remove the border here. I only want to set the layer's main color. So I'm going to select a base yellow that I like. That's a little vibrant. That's pretty light. And I'm going to do the same I did for the background here for the box behind the text. Press Ctrl-Alt-G or Ctrl-Shift-G in your case by default to create a new mask layer. G to select the gradient tool, and I'm going to pick an orange color, or let's go with some peach tone that I'm going to use to add a bit of shade to the text. Alright, so we have the base for our thumbnail. Now we can add a few layer styles. We're going to add some drop shadow on the text here. I'm going to save this file to my desktop. Let's call it thumbnail tutorial. And I recommend that you do that pretty early on, because when you start to mess with layer styles at the moment, they can crash or hang Krita sometimes. So be wary of that. Now you can right click on any layer. So you want to right click on the group that contains our text, and you're going to click on layer style. And this opens a window that allows us to set a reusable style for our layer. So I'm going to click drop shadow, Allow me to move this to the side, and you should see the drop shadow appear already on the text. Now we're going to lower the opacity of the shadow here, and to change its direction a little bit, I'm going to use 90 degrees to have the shadow come from the top of the screen and drop down. You can also change the distance and the size, so size corresponds to the softness or the blur of the shadow, right? And you can even add a bit of noise to make it more photographic if you want to integrate it with some photo or real-world elements or textures, for example. We can also tweak the color. Now you can change the color palette to be the same you use in the palette docker, and in general I recommend to work with color palettes if you can. Let's select David Revoi's great color palette, and we're going to use a dark brown here. I'm going to darken it a little bit just to give my shadow a bit of a tone to it. It's using the multiply mode, so it's going to multiply what's under it, but there you go. We get a bit of shadow that way. Now we're going to add texture to our background box. For that, I'm going to select my concrete layer, press Ctrl J to duplicate it. I'm then going to unlock this one and right-click, go to flatten the layer. This is going to convert it to a pixel layer that we can scale and manipulate. Now this one I'm going to put in my background group. I should really start to rename them, so let's drag and drop it inside the background group. I'm going to press select it, press F2 to rename it, so call it background. I'm going to call the top layer foreground, or text rather, it makes more sense. Then you can right click on any layer to change the layer's color, the group's color, but also the layers inside of it, right? I'm going to group the background elements here. Let's call that box, and call the group at the bottom background rather. All right, and I'm going to lock that group. By the way, the reason to lock a group is so that when you press R and click, it's not going to select the layer. So if I go on the text and press R click on the background, it's never going to select the background by accident. Right, so now on my box, I have a new layer that's taking the entire document. I'm going to click the alpha inherit to clip it to that layer at the bottom, that vector box, then change the layer style from normal to overlay. And it's going to add some details to our underlying layer. Now the good thing about that is if you select your vector shape and you change the color, so you select a more vibrant or a more saturated color, you will still retain that texture on it. Now we want to offset that texture a little bit compared to the background, and maybe to scale it as well. So you can press Ctrl T for that, and Ctrl Shift and drag to change the scale. So I'm going to make the texture a little bigger in that case to make the box feel like it's a bit more in the foreground compared to the background. It's not the difference is not outstandingly big, but it does make a bit of a difference. I'm going to increase the opacity of the background shadow as well, and I'm going to add a new layer inside of the background group, so I have to unlock it for that at the top of the group. And we're going to use the gradient tool to add a bit of a shadow right behind the box to separate the box with the title from the concrete background. So I'm going to use the same purple here and go to the multiply mode. Then lower the opacity of that shadow. You can press T to toggle the move tool and offset that shadow, move it down a little bit. Now when I get there, often I want to boost the contrast a little bit, right? So in practice, I might play using different background textures depending on what I do, or I might just create a new layer and pick a brush that I like. So I'm going to grab one from our library, one that has a bit of special texture to it, like this one. I'll make it pretty big, and I might just select, some nice color. This one is a bit special, so it's a bit slow. But you can see that with just one brush stroke, I can create a really interesting design behind it. So to give my thumbnail a bit more style, if you want, so I'll do things like these. It's a lot of experimentation at this point. So past that point, I like to boost the contrast on my layers. If I find the colors could use a little, I can make it a little shinier. So I go to the top of my layers and I'm going to go to the Add Layers menu and add a filter layer. This is a non-destructive filter that you can edit at any time. One I particularly like is the color curves, also called color adjustment in Krita. The reason being, when you use the RGBA channel, you can already boost the contrast, like the value contrast, but also the colors at the same time. So you're really adding contrast to the entire image. But you can also go in the lightness mode, and then it will preserve the colors, but you can darken or lighten parts of your image. The bottom range represents your input range, and the vertical one represents the output. So when you create, for example, in a dark area, you click to add a point to the curve, and you lower it, what you're doing is telling Krita in that range, and especially around where that point is, where you have the dip here, I want to lower my values. So if the input is that dark gray, the output will be darker than that, as you can see. I'm going to make it a little extreme so you can really see how everything in that range, I'm clamping it, I'm setting it to pure black, and you can see how we have a lot more black in our image when I do so. So this is how curves work. On the other hand, if I go a bit extreme by adding lightness to the right here, I'm going to take that part of the range here, so from light gray to pure white, everything that is really light in my image. If I create a point and I drag it up like that, you can see I'm clamping, I'm boosting all that part of the range to white. And let's make it really extreme so you can see if I were to add a point and pull it up, I would take the entire range and make it all white, because we can see the line here means everything that is in that range, the output will be pure white. All right, so let's clean that up. I'm going to drag the points out of the view to remove them and go back to the RGBA channel. So I'm just doing a bit of an S-curve to add contrast to my image and especially lighten the light parts. Now I can press OK, and first I can toggle the filter on and off. So you can see that the starting image was a little washed out and the resulting image is pretty vibrant. You could stack multiple filter layers here. One thing that's really nice to do is go on the background layer and you can add a filter layer inside of the group. So I'm going to go to filter layer and add a bit of a blur to the background. You can go to the blur category in the filter selector and select, for instance, Gaussian blur. You can see how as I increase the slider, the background feels like it's a bit more in the background because it's blurry. We are adding a bit of depth to the image. Now this is non-destructive, so anytime you can right click and go to the properties of the layer, or you can press the F3 shortcut to edit your values. A window will pop up and let you do that, which is really the beauty of it. Blurring the background is useful to add foreground elements and make them pop. So this is what we're going to do. For that, we're not going to create the images from scratch. I'm going to pull from my library, and I recommend doing that. So I have a library in my graphic design folder here, and a video subfolder where I have a few reusable assets. So let's say this would be the main image for my tutorial. So I click and drag it on Krita and insert it either as a file layer or a new layer. When you use the new layer option, this will instantly be a raster or pixel layer, so you can instantly scale the asset. It's going to be a little blurry here because I'm scaling it up. The image is not that big by default, but then I can quickly press, for example, Control M to bring my color adjustment filter and quickly boost the contrast of that image, although I should really put it above everything so it's not affected by our filter layer that we have at the top of the composition. I'm going to boost the contrast on this bad boy. And let's add a Krita logo as well. So I have a few logos for the programs I use, the free software I work with. I'm going to click and drag the Krita logo here, put it around the bottom next to that Krita text. Note that anytime, if you press the R key, you can select a layer that corresponds to what you click on. Now, if you keep the shift key down, so I'm going to alt click on my Krita icon to select it. With the shift key, you can select another layer, add it to the selection. So I'm going to shift click on the text and note that it's going to select the filter layer. So I'm going to lock this one and redo the operation. So select the Krita icon, then shift click on the text, and this will select it. I have to select the entire group though. So I'm going to do it in the layers docker, and then shift and press T to go to the transform tool, and shift click to shift the layers to the right a little bit. So I give my icon a little more space. I want to have the same shadow on the text and on the icon. One thing we could do is drag the icon inside the text, but I don't want the filter to be applied to it. So instead I'm going to take my two elements here and group them with Ctrl G. Then we are going to save our layer style. So select the text layer that has the little FX icon, right click, layer style, and anytime you can click the export button to create a layer style library. Krita calls it Photoshop layer style library, but it's just layer styles in general for Krita. So you can save it. I'm going to save it on the desktop. Let's call it drop shadow. And then when you take any layer here, you right click, go to layer style, you can go to your styles. You will get the embedded style, so you can anytime you can grab any style that you have on any layer in your document and duplicate it on anything. So we can do that. But if you are working across documents, you can see I already have a drop shadow.asl in here that has the drop shadow style. You can click import and go locate your file, open it, and it will add it to Krita's custom styles that you can reuse across documents. Now we can go to that thumbnail tutorial, so you'll see the embedded keyword in parentheses and select our shadow style here that will apply to our layer. Let's add a final touch. I'm going to grab a nice brush from our brush set. Let's see, how about this one? Yeah, it seems to be fast enough, so you could do something like a few squiggles, so to give it a bit of a cartoony look and make the layer pop even more. I'm going to do that to add a few brush marks. And there you have the final result. These techniques apply to game art, to illustration. You can really reuse them around layer styles, and everything I've shown here can be really useful whether you are creating a comic, you are creating game art, you are doing graphic design in general, doing UI design, whatever. I hope that you liked the tutorial. If you have any tips or tricks for doing things like these in Krita, please share them in the comments with everyone else, so that way we can become better artists together. But for now, I want to thank you kindly for watching. Be creative, have fun, and we'll see one another in the next one. Bye-bye.